Today, Scott and I are going to talk about doing research in online and teaching and learning environments. And we kind of alluded to it before with our kind of open discussion questions, and it was great hearing some of the responses with, like the historical evolution. We could certainly, I think it begs the question, are we talking about the online environment? So is it the internet, the computer, or like the principles that are involved in it, like distance education, the separation of teacher and student? And then we can kind of even go back even further, right, to like radio, TV, like Saul, you alluded to that, maybe even correspondence education and back and back. So yeah, uh, all this to say, when we look at sort of a trend, so for those of us that were like sort of in this space or researching online education or interested in doing research about it, prior to the pandemic, there was always a trend, right? And the trend was that enrollments were growing year over year, just a little bit, right? And then we had this spike, as it were, as it was, right? And that's the pandemic, right? And but still, sort of kind of now where things are sort of trending is an upward direction, right? But I imagine, right, this will kind of fall back, but maybe still be on that sort of upward trend, but maybe not as drastic kind of thing. And this data is from iPads. But if you can look at this kind of thing, trends with other sources like edX or Coursera or big like high enrollment online courses and how the trends kind of grow in numbers for that. So what we wanted to kind of talk about today was we're just going to talk about some of the foundational ideas with educational research, talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that you might come across, give you some steps or things that you can do to get started or even try it out. And then we'll talk about this learning community, EC3 learning community that Scott and I are facilitating that we hope you'll all join us once a month to talk about these things in more of a community of practice like the OTC is. It's a wonderful model that we have. So what is educational research? Educational research it can be a pretty big bucket, right? Pretty broad. I would imagine all of us with all of our different backgrounds and experiences, our expertise, and the fact that we're kind of at UMB suggests that we could do educational research, with the just myriad topics of things that we could be focused on. But in a general sense, trying to break this down, right? I'm okay with taxonomies or trying to categorize things or breaking things down into smaller, more manageable chunks. Educational research, you could think of it as just being this broad focus, like policies, practices, generalizable, right? And so you can think of it as kind of like the big bucket. If you take it, a smaller chunk of it and call it the scholarship of teaching and learning, right? This is more about research. I think it tends to be a little bit more reflexive or reflective in nature. And it's about improving or studying teaching and learning in specific contexts. So this is, trying to better ourselves as teachers in a medium like online, or to improve the student experience, which we mentioned in our conversation earlier, in online environments. Yeah, so it's kind of studying what we're doing, how it's working, how we can improve it, trying different things. These could be educational interventions or different things. So, and you get into the research and online teaching and learning, right? It's systematically doing this to try to improve practice, student learning outcomes, and kind of the intersection, right? Because when we get into the online medium or online learning environment, there's usually a learning management system or a course management system or some sort of technological sort of intermediary, right? It used to, when we studied it in the day, we used to call it mediated communication because it was technologically mediated communication. So there's this intermediary that's getting in between the sort of what used to happen in person, right? Or just face to face. So studying sort of how things change or evolve in those environments is what online teaching and learning is all about. So you can think of this as, big buckets kind of getting broken down into smaller pieces, and I'd like to think of this more as like, it's kind of all one and the same, right? Whether it's educational research, scholarship, teaching and learning, whether you're focusing on studying online teaching and learning specifically, the whole idea is about improvement, right? Or just trying to study it, learn more, disseminate, communicate what you learn to others so that they can benefit from it. It's about applying a systematic approach to your inquiry. You can get into methodological rigor, things like that, but there are a lot of different ways and types of studies that you can do. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. The idea is that we're generating some evidence from what we're doing to inform our theory and our practice, and collaboration is all about sharing our findings with one another. And I'm sharing this pedagogical triad here, or the pedagogical triangle, as this is like ever present in whatever research we're doing in whatever environment. In online spaces in particular, sometimes we forget that this is really just the situation that's happening, right? It's the teacher, the student, the content, and the relationships that are existing between those. So the teacher-student's an interpersonal relationship, the teacher to the content's more of like a pedagogical relationship, and the student to the content's more of a didactic kind of relationship. So I like to keep that sort of front of mind whenever I'm doing research in online teaching and learning, because sometimes the technologies that are bright, new, and shiny and flashy kind of overshadow what we're actually trying to study, which is essentially how this triangle can best interact. So in the online space, I think that something that I've noticed just over the years with is kind of like, quote unquote, my online is different than your online. So we all have different experiences with what online education is, or what it can be, or what it should be, right? And this kind of comes through in various modalities, right? So some of us might know online education as synchronous sessions in Zoom, right? Where that's my online education. Other of us might know it more as like asynchronous in nature. Anytime, any place, I'm going to, communicate here and there as I see fit asynchronously in this online learning management system, right? So, and then it could be that you've had some introduction to a hybrid or a blended environment where some of your stuff was online, but most of it was in the classroom. And there's this term where you're kind of using online resources in a classroom setting as a web-enhanced kind of class, or technology-enhanced classroom kind of thing, right? But it's a continuum, right? So I think when we conceptualize how to study online teaching and learning, a good place to kind of figure out where we are is what the modality in which we're trying to explore. And this is a little bit more emerging, right? This term bichronous, it's kind of the study of asynchronous online learning that incorporates synchronous elements. So kind of what's happening, I'd say a little bit more pre-pandemic, and then post-pandemic, it seems to be a more regular occurrence, where you have a traditionally asynchronous online course, but the instructors are incorporating synchronous Zoom meetings or sessions throughout that instruction. Now, this isn't something that's like a student selects when they're enrolling for a course, like I'm going to take this kind of course. This is more of just like a term from researchers who are studying this, and it's more academic in nature. Because in another institution, a student might select a distance education version of a course, or a hybrid format, or a completely online format. So this is just more of trying to describe what's happening in some ways. So we've kind of talked about this in our little open discussion a little bit, but some of the more common research topics that you're going to see in online teaching and learning research are about student engagement, student assessment, the teacher-student relationship, and how technology is impacting or influencing those sorts of exchanges. And I think these are just examples, right? So the general category and an example of what you might study with student engagement or assessment, or things like that. So we've also kind of alluded to this too. There are some common theoretical frameworks for online teaching and learning research that you may or may not be familiar with, but we just want to talk about them very briefly here. Community of inquiry, is a theoretical framework that was built out of the study of text-based asynchronous discussion forums. And this was kind of right at the turn of the century where there was a lot of people that were kind of naysayers of online education and saying it's not as valuable, it's not as effective, it's not, as good kind of a thing. So the researchers here really wanted to see, is learning taking place here, right? And if so, how? And then they sort of conceptualized this theory based on analyzing discussion forums and posts and replies and things like that. And what they sort of gathered was for an online learning environment to be a successful educational experience is that it has to have these sort of three things. Teaching presence, the students need to know that the teacher's in the online learning environment. The social presence, they need to feel that they're connected to others, including their teacher, but other students as well. And then the cognitive presence, that there's sort of, I'd like to think of it as like a challenge, right? They're being challenged in their thinking and what they're being asked to do to what you might call, you're always in a state of becoming, right? If you're the student. So it's about becoming more. That's what cognitive presence is about. And then the technology acceptance model, that's common to if you're introducing new technologies into the classroom. You could think of examples, right? Like it'd be interesting to see a study on the technology acceptance model with AI or ChatGPT in online learning environments, but in the past, it might have been like the learning management itself, whether students were accepting that, or other things. It could be VoiceThread, SoftChalk, like Prezi, like any of those ed tech kind of tools that you could think of might use something like that. Other things that might be more common if you're trying to like wrap your head around some theories that could help you do a study in online teaching and learning would be the TPACK framework. Probably a little bit more common in K-12 environments. It's just too many words for me, right, to follow with all those little Venn diagrams of circles and stuff. But the general idea is about sort of taking a deep dive into that teacher student or teacher content kind of relationship and exploring what we know about our content, what we know about the technology that we're using, what we know about our teaching strategies, and really kind of breaking that down into the online space. And then I've always liked transactional distance theory that's in the 80s. It just deals with structure, dialogue, and autonomy. And that as these things vary, right, the sense of transactional distance that students will feel with their teachers in online learning environments varies. So, if you uh, have a lot of dialogue but no structure, right? Or if you have a lot of or no dialogue and a lot of structure, I like to think of transactional distance as sort of the psychological distance that students feel from their learning environment or from their teacher in the online space. So I'm going to hand this over to Scott to kind of walk us through how you might conceptualize the some study designs for this kind of research.
All right, thank you. And I remembered to unmute, so I'm very proud of myself right now. Yeah, the first major question that we get to ask at this point is, now that we have all this information, how do we study these things in educational online research? And there are three well-established methodological approaches to it. The first is the qualitative method, which uses non-numerical information to gather insights about your research question. Quantitative uses numeric information to do the same thing. And then there's mixed methods, which includes both. And what I really like about this image is if you notice the three individuals standing on their method box, quantitative and qualitative are saying that theirs is the best, where mixed methods is mentioning what's kind of a key theme or a key idea in any kind of educational research is that the research question drives everything. This image really resonates with me because I am by training very quantitative. And so when I started getting interested in educational research, I was very much reading all of the quantitative stuff. And it's important to remember, and I've learned throughout my experiences in educational research, that it really is the research question that kind of tells you where you need to go, what methods you should use. And so if we think about these methods as toolboxes for us to reach into and design our studies, In each one of them, there are a set of tools. You can see a list for quantitative and qualitative here. And while I don't have time to go into all of them, I do want to highlight two of my favorites. So on the quantitative side, correlational studies are used to examine a relationship between two variables that you don't manipulate, with the goal of looking at whether the relationship exists, what its strengths are, and if it's positive, negative, or some kind of inconsistent. What's really cool is how these studies can be applied. One of the great uh, research questions that's been asked using a correlation study is, what is the relationship between screen time and academic performance? And so there have been a lot of interesting findings based on trying to correlate these two features of a system. On the qualitative side, I really like to highlight case studies. Their goal is to explore the complexities and unique features of a case in the real world to kind of gather insights. And one of the primary examples of this in educational research was a study that was done at Hawthorne High School, where they looked at a major technological integration. They basically took as much technology as they could and crammed it into the school. And the research study really focused on understanding how the tools were incorporated into the teaching and learning practices, how the teachers adapted their instructional designs based on the technology that were available, and what was the third one? I'm blanking. Hold on. How students reacted to it. And so those are two really good examples of tools that you can take from the quantitative and qualitative side. Moving on to mixed methodologies, there are three primary tools that we kind of call on. First is the sequential explanatory design, where you start by collecting quantitative data and then follow up with qualitative data to further analyze your findings and get a deeper understanding of your quantitative findings. Sequential exploratory design focuses on, oh man, I'm blanking here. You use qualitative uh, qualitative techniques to then inform what kind of quantitative techniques you should use to further a study. And then concurrent triangulation studies focused on using mixed method approaches to cross-validate and compare and contrast things. So you're collecting data simultaneously. You're collecting quantitative, qualitative data simultaneously to converge on certain ideas or topics. And so those are the tools that you can use. We then move on to the idea of ethical considerations. And when you're thinking about educational research, I really like that informed consent is at the top of the slide because it kind of covers the other two topics. If you do informed consent well, you cover privacy, confidentiality, and voluntary participation. So the idea of informed consent is that you're giving as much information to your participants in the study as possible, providing transparency and the known risks to your study group. You also tell the individuals through privacy and confidentiality clauses how their data will be used, stored, and protected. And what's really key about this entire idea of informed consent and the ethical considerations behind it is that throughout this whole process in your research, the participants are voluntary, and that if they choose to withdraw from the study, that there'll be no negative consequences or punishment, which is a key issue when there could be a pretty big power dynamic in play. If you're the professor in the classroom trying to do this research, you want your participants to not feel like if they don't voluntarily participate, that there are going to be consequences to their grade. So this is a really great, informed consent is an excellent mechanism to address some of these ethical issues that should always be considered with these kinds of studies. And so the next topic that we can talk about are the methods for data collection. And you can see here there are surveys and questionnaires, learning analytics, interviews and focus groups, content analysis. While many of these can be used in both a qualitative and quantitative sense, I want to relate this slide back to the original methodology slide, and that depending on what your research question is and the themes and ideas that you're trying to explore, each one of these can be appropriate in its own way. And so with that, we can move to the next slide. So coming back to the idea of educational research specifically, what are some of the opportunities, some of the research areas, and some of the advantages of coming into this research space? And I'd really like to highlight that with the learning management systems we have, like Blackboard, it allows us to collect a lot of rich data for learning analytics. We can look at engagement, we can look at learning outcomes. And so technology has provided us with a great tool to use and an area of research. What's the difference between you learning management systems and doing it the old-fashioned way, collecting it and saving it in an Excel spreadsheet or a paper workbook? Another topic that's really interesting that can be investigated is the use of AI tools, both for personalized learning for the students and extracting data insights from our research. And the last thing is digital assessments, immediate feedback. What happens when our students get their material back instantly versus 2 weeks, et cetera, et cetera. But with opportunities, we have to think of this as a double-edged sword. This research field also comes with some serious challenges, technology limitations. If we're teaching synchronously across campuses, and this has happened to me personally, what happens when the Wi-Fi goes out? How does that hinder student engagement, student interaction? Speaking of student engagement, I feel like we all have the perception that it's a little harder to get students to participate in completely online environments. And so there are a lot of areas of research in online education that focus on student engagement. And then also data security and privacy. With the incorporation of this technology, how are we going to use this data ethically to gather insights and research new innovations? And there's a lot of overlap between the opportunities and challenges there that lead to bigger ideas, specifically with data complexity. When you have more data and different types of data, it's harder to analyze. How do you navigate that? And we also need to consider, especially with data privacy, how we're balancing our teaching innovations with consideration for the populations we're serving. The next slide is, let's talk about just creating a basic research plan. Now that we have an understanding of the methodologies and ethical considerations, how do I go about creating a SOTL plan? So the first step is to identify a research question, and you really want to focus on a specific problem because, again, this drives your entire study and the entire design. You'll choose a methodology, one of the major three, and develop a data collection plan, whether you're doing surveys, interviews, or analytics of, in this case, your online course. And then lastly, you'll analyze that data using statistical tools or thematic analysis. There's one step that isn't here. Oh, and it's revealed on the next slide, and that's the outcome. But we'll talk about this with an example research plan. So if you were interested in getting into the online educational research place, this may be space. This may be something you want to explore. How do students use AI generated content in online discussion forums? And how does that influence the quality and depth of teacher student content interactions? You could approach this in a lot of different ways. One way may be through mixed methodologies where you use both quantitative analysis for discussion participation and qualitative analysis for student reflections. You can collect that data through your learning management system, at least the quantitative part, and generate some kind of metric for discussion, as well as you can later on interview students and gather their perspectives on the benefits and challenges and have a set of qualitative data. You can then analyze that data, and lastly, you can publish it and report out to a faculty development group. So that's an example of a research plan. And so with all of that, we'd like to pose a final question. And that final question is very much, how do online learning environments affect engagement in classroom culture? What research could you do to explore this? Any thoughts?
I mean, if you wanted to have like a true experiment, you'd have two groups, right? One that's online and one that's not online, and compare engagement across the two if it was experimental.
Adding on to Michelle's, let's say you do have two groups, both online. One class has discussions, or maybe even in-person voluntary sessions when there can be some kind of contact, and the other one does just straight asynchronous assignments. And which one is they found better? Same material, same everything. Like how much engagement is necessary? At what point it's not necessary? At what Like where? Like how many discussion boards? How many things? Is it even necessary?
So with that, I'm really curious, from both of you, what methodologies would you use to try and answer that question?
For me, mixed methods, absolutely, because it's not only important to see how long were they engaged in terms of numbers online and how many posts and things. That's not just the engagement, but also I would like to ask them open-ended questions, like what did they like it? Did they get anything out of it? Like more of their attitudes and perceptions, because just because they answered 3 classmates does not mean they enjoyed enjoyed it. They could have been like, and also the instructions, like answer how many, respond to X amount of classmates, does not mean that they wanted to.
Yeah, great answer, Larissa. Ditto to that.
Also,
This
I
is,
would, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh, go for it, Larissa.
Also, I would, with the qualitative, I also want to know what else is going on in their lives. You were not part of it. Like if my students are on clinical, I don't care how great my class is, they just want to get it done. So but they do enjoy specific aspects of certain classes, because that's something I asked them. Like, so what else is happening in their lives, which can affect their engagement and things like that.
Another aspect of this is that some of this data is existing within our programs. I did programmatic assessment for Frostburg State PA program, and I can say that, when we were pushed into the online space, and then afterwards we have programmatic evaluation, and there's multiple data points. You can, of course, there's grades, there is midpoint evaluations, there are students' evaluations of the courses, there's faculty evaluation of those pieces, and to some degree, there are external data in terms of some of the PAEA exams, and a lot of that already shows up in our programmatic evaluation. So it's a matter of rethinking how to use the data we're already thinking about.
Yeah, I really like that concept of using data that you've already collected or data that you're already thinking about to progress some of these research ideas and questions. I do want to be conscious of everybody's time. We have 2 more slides that are shameless plugs for our community. Are there any other thoughts before we move forward? Okay.
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick and say I appreciate Larissa and Dave. Thank you for sharing those. And it's like, yeah, I think in some ways you can start to think of yourself in that role. So not necessarily observing others or like other things that you might have or data that you already have, but like reflective practice. Is putting this in a Zoom format, right? Like the best way to deliver this information to students, or do I do lecture videos? Is that effective? Or like you try to explore, like we do this naturally anyway. We explore with our teaching and learning and try to figure out what works best for us and our students. And so in some ways, this kind of research is about that, right? In your online environment, is figuring out what I do. Does it work well? Why does it work well? Systemize that and share it with others so that we can all learn from that experience. And yeah, I guess I can get into this. So this is our Ed Crafters Community Connection. Shameless plug, 2 minutes. This is what we have. We meet on the 3rd Friday of the month for an hour, just like this, from 12 to 1. We do a presentation in the beginning, then we open it up to discussion, and we have some sort of interactive component, exit ticket. We also developed a workbook that can support you if you're interested in taking a deeper dive and doing educational research in online spaces or just educational research in general. Our next meeting is in October. That's the link to register for the meeting series. And, this is what we feel are the benefits of it. We have a growing community. we can support each other, learn from our collective expertise. We can walk the ground on various things. We can be a little accountable to one another, and hopefully that helps us all grow and produce more educational research and scholarship. So thank you.